What's good? It's Woog. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. We have Devin Haney, 26 wins and 0 losses, defending his WBC lightweight title against Joseph JoJo Diaz, 32 wins, 1 loss, and 1 draw. This fight is taking place on December 4th in Las Vegas, Nevada. And this is Devin Haney's first fight since his biggest step-up opponent and unanimous decision win over Jorge Linares in May. A fight where Devin Haney notably got rocked towards the end, or should I say at the very end, of one of the late rounds of the fight versus Linares, who has prodigious punching power in the lightweight division, former multiple-time champ and multi-divisional champ Jorge Linares. So Devin Haney is one of the names at lightweight who is on this trajectory among the different young prospects or champions in boxing. I mean, this list includes Gervonta Davis, who is a multi-divisional champion and is a few years older than the rest of the class that I'm about to mention. But it's Gervonta Davis, it's Devin Haney, and then Ryan Garcia, Shakur Stevenson, who is at 130, started off at 126, now is at 130, still one division below these other guys. But Devin Haney is a part of this class that is reinvigorated the lightweight division and is making boxing a lot more exciting. If only they could get any of these guys to fight each other. Now, these guys are all still young, so they're all working out their respective career paths. Ryan Garcia had his biggest step up against Luke Campbell, ended up stopping him. Devin Haney, as I mentioned, just had an impressive unanimous decision win over Jorge Linares. Gervonta Tank Davis has the most interesting opponent-by-opponent selection. He'll fight once at, he had a belt at 130, a lesser belt at 135 after beating a former featherweight champ, Yorkie's Gamboa. Then he fights Leo Santa Cruz, and Santa Cruz was a little out of his division. And then Gervonta Davis jumped way up to 140 to challenge somebody who people don't really regard as an elite 140 guy, but a respectable 140 guy, Mario Barrios, ended up stopping him. So it's a lot of kind of jockeying for position and a lot of mouth service in terms of guys saying that other guys are ducking them. The only actual documented duck that we have to this date between these guys is when Ryan Garcia was named the mandatory challenger for Devin Haney's WBC title, and then he basically turned that opportunity down in hopes of chasing down a fight with Manny Pacquiao, or, he was calling out Gervonta Davis at the time. None of that materialized, and Ryan Garcia hasn't fought in nearly a year now. Also took some time off and cited mental health as the reason to pull out of a fight with Javier Fortuna, a very respectable opponent and a rugged fighter, somebody who Joseph JoJo Diaz actually fought in his last fight. But there's a lot of clearing up that needs to happen in order to really determine who is who and what is what in this pretty stacked lightweight division, where all of the guys, again, are fighting other opponents other than the guys who most fans want to see them fight. So Devin Haney, I remember watching him as like a 16-year-old. Like, this guy was fighting in Tijuana, Mexico, already had a growing YouTube channel, was basically addressing the camera like, hey, you're watching Devin Haney TV. I'm like sitting back watching like, who's this guy? He was trained by like Floyd Mayweather Sr. at the time, and he just had a very polished presentation where it's like, I don't know whether you're a great boxer or somebody who's being groomed to be a celebrity or both, but I was impressed by his rollout of his professional career. Again, he was fighting grown men when he was like 16 and a half, 17 years old. Well, now we're a couple years removed from that, and then he knocked out like Antonio Moran, and this is where he starts fighting on actual TV as they start giving him, one slight step up opponent after another. So after he fought Antonio Moran, Haney then fights for the vacant WBC interim lightweight title against Zaur Abdullayev. And this was a beautiful knockout win for Devin Haney. This is one of those like knockout of the year candidates, and it happened in the 4th round. This was a couple years ago now. This is September 2019. That actually marks Devin Haney's last stoppage win to date, because after that, he fought Alfredo Santiago, who was kind of a long-ranging fighter, gave Devin Haney some trouble in the early rounds. Like, he had this looping overhand right hand. So Devin Haney had to account for that. It wasn't his best showing, but he still did what he had to do. Won a decision, a unanimous decision against Alfredo Santiago, and then he fights Yuriorkis Gamboa, which was seen to be another step up, although Gamboa is almost 40 years old, and Devin Haney basically won just about every round against former featherweight champ Gamboa. But, you know, the boxing world wasn't that impressed because he didn't stop Gamboa, and they had just seen Gervonta Davis stop Gamboa. And again, Gamboa is basically 40 years old, 2 divisions up from where he was once champ. But I thought it was an impressive domination over Gamboa for Devin Haney. He then has that step-up fight with Jorge Linares, where, I mean, he was taking it to Linares. He wasn't fighting that kind of back foot, counter-punching style where he leads with the jab and basically controls the fight with the jab. No, he mixed it up with Linares. He kind of took the fight to Linares in a lot of those rounds. Was winning very competitive rounds versus Linares. Linares, again, caught him at the end of one of the late rounds. It was either the 8th or the 9th round. Devin Haney makes it out of that and ends up, finishing the fight in kind of, lackluster fashion. I mean, I do think that he won one of the last couple rounds, but he was basically no longer jumping into the pocket the way that he was in the prior rounds against Linares. Again, Linares is a big puncher, a good athlete too, a sharp shooter, pretty fast puncher. So Devin Haney is one of those kind of shining young stars in the game. And now he's fighting Joseph Diaz, who, he was one of the main Golden Boy prospects coming up. He was fighting on a lot of prominent undercards. And then he gets a title shot against Gary Russell Jr., who's had one of the most frustrating title reigns over the past 5 to 10 years. Gary Russell, I see, is one of the truest special talents in boxing, but he just isn't fighting often enough. Hasn't fought since, just before the pandemic started. We haven't seen Gary Russell in almost 2 years now. But Gary Russell Jr. has some of the fastest hands, if not the fastest hands, pound for pound in boxing. And, Gary Russell Jr. kind of cruised to a unanimous decision win against then undefeated Joseph Diaz. One of Gary Russell's best wins to date, to be honest. I mean, he's had a couple good ones. Johnny Gonzalez, King Tug Niambiar. But yeah, it was an impressive win against Joseph Diaz. Joseph Diaz then went on to win his next 5 fights. And the 5th of those 5 fights was another title opportunity against Tevin Farmer, who, when DAZN started really making inroads into the U.S., Tevin Farmer was one of the most prominently featured American boxers on DAZN because most of the guys that they were featuring were from the UK. But Tevin Farmer was fighting every few months, a super busy schedule, several title defenses of that IBF 130-pound belt that Tevin Farmer was holding. A very technical fighter. He had a rough start to his career, but kind of grinded it out, improved his skills, and then was looking really sharp in his title defenses. And again, he was fighting on DAZN very prominently, headlining DAZN cards. Well, then he met up with Joseph Diaz, and this was one of the weirder fights. There was this early head clash that cut Joseph Diaz's eye really, really bad to where there was concern on whether the fight was going to be stopped, in the early rounds. And Joseph Diaz basically started putting his foot on the gas, and Tevin Farmer, to my eyes, didn't look like the same defensively responsible, kind of slip and mover and counter puncher, very crisp, very sharp. Didn't look like the same Tevin Farmer that we were used to seeing. And Sergio Mora, throughout the broadcast, was discussing that as Joseph Diaz started to win the middle and late rounds against Tevin Farmer, ended up winning a unanimous decision over Tevin Farmer and thereby capturing the IBF super featherweight 130-pound title. And we haven't seen Tevin Farmer in the ring since that loss. And that was back in January 2020. Again, this was pre-pandemic. And again, I'm watching this, Farmer versus JoJo Diaz fight. And that head clash happened. And while we're concerned about, the bleeding in the eye of Joseph Diaz, it makes me wonder if something happened to Tevin Farmer with that head clash to where it threw his equilibrium off. Because he didn't even seem like he had his feet all the way under him. Either there was some weight draining issue where Tevin Farmer might have been having trouble making 130, and I don't think we'll see Tevin Farmer at 130 again. as it stood, it sounded like he only had a couple fights left at 130 before he was going to make the decision to go up to 135. But I wonder about the weight drain. I wonder about that really bad head clash. And Tevin Farmer might have damaged his hand. Like after round 1, he goes back to his corner. His corner gives him instruction and he says, oh yeah, that's because I hurt my hand. They said, what? I hurt my hand. I'm all right though. But he basically declared to his corner after the first round that he hurt his lead right hand because he's a southpaw. So I wonder how compromised Tevin Farmer was in this fight versus JoJo Diaz. But I don't want to take away from JoJo Diaz's arguably most significant win to date. It's definitely one of them. So he captured the IBF belt and then he loses the belt on the scale over a year later. So he fights Tevin Farmer, wins the IBF belt. The pandemic happens. We don't see JoJo Diaz for like another year. He returns to the ring to defend his title against Shavkat Rakhimov, and he misses weight and loses the title on the scale. Ends up fighting a very competitive fight versus Rakhimov. It's ruled a draw, a majority draw. Tough fight for both guys. Like, this was very disappointing because you had just worked so hard to capture a belt. He finally does. Again, loses it on the scale, fights a very good, tough, competitive fight with Rakhimov. It's ruled a draw. Neither guy ends up being champion. I think they're still sorting out what to do with that IBF belt. JoJo Diaz then moves up again to lightweight because when he fought Gary Russell Jr. in that title challenge in 2018, that was at 126, and then he went up and had several fights at 130, wins a belt, loses it on the scale. Then he goes up to 135 to fight a top 10 ranked Javier Fortuna, who's, given as good as he's gotten, very competitive fights with guys like Robert Easter Jr., a 6-footer at 135. Javier Fortuna is about 5'7", but again, very rugged, throws a lot of combinations. He's involved in a lot of head clashes, a lot of roughhouse tactics, a lot of volume coming from Javier Fortuna. And JoJo Diaz, like he did Tevin Farmer, outworked Javier Fortuna with his combinations, with jumping in and out of the pocket, with his precise punching. He's a very accurate puncher, JoJo Diaz is. And he ends up winning a unanimous decision against an opponent who most people thought this is like a 50-50 fight. I don't know who to go with. Well, JoJo Diaz, again, looked very impressive against Javier Fortuna. To me, that fight, that win, and the win against Tevin Farmer are probably his two best wins to date. And that Javier Fortuna is his last fight before this upcoming Devin Haney versus JoJo Diaz fight. So he's got a lot of momentum coming into this one. I still see him as a undersized 135. Now, he's kind of I'm not going to say pudgy, but just body style wise. You could tell he's the type who I think is going to gain a lot of weight once he stops training professional boxing. He just has a body that seems to lend itself to putting on a lot of pounds. And I mean, he had trouble making 130. He had trouble making 126 before that. So maybe he's very comfortable at lightweight. I just look at the rest of the elite lightweight division, and I wonder how he does against somebody who's as devastating a puncher as Teofimo Lopez, or as, kind of settled into 135. Even though I look at Lomachenko as being kind of a small-ish 135, I thought he had his best days at 130 and 126, even though, again, he's still great at 135, not as dominant as he was at 131 or 126. But I wonder how JoJo Diaz, with his 5'6" build, Devin Haney's about 5'8", and his, 64-inch reach, I believe? Yeah, 64-inch reach for JoJo Diaz versus the 71-inch reach of Devin Haney. I wonder how his stature is going to hold up against the elite in the division. We're about to find out because he's about to take on one of the most talented people in the division. And again, this is a very important fight for Devin Haney because of the step up. And, JoJo Diaz, again, former champion, like Linares was former champion. But unlike JoJo Diaz, Linares was a former champion at lightweight. JoJo Diaz, 130-pound former champion. So what do I expect out of Devin Haney versus JoJo Diaz? I think JoJo Diaz is going to have to force a fight with Devin Haney. There's no way that he's going to out-sweet science a sweet scientist like Devin Haney. Devin Haney's got He does some of that, that Philly shell. You could tell he's from like the school of Floyd Mayweather in terms of boxing philosophy. Just the quintessential hit and not get hit. Devin Haney is it appears, he's about as good as it gets at that. At least against the competition that he's fought thus far. We don't know how that's going to hold against the elite, but that is basically the style of Devin Haney. Now, again, he has scored a devastating knockout against Abdullayev, scored a knockout win over Antonio Moran. He's kind of become classified as somebody who is, I would say, one of the best round winners in boxing. Like one of the guys who, will just kind of cruise to a lopsided decision win, more so than knocking the other guy out. That doesn't mean that he doesn't have some pop in his punches. I think he does. He just doesn't catch the guy in a way where they totally didn't see the punch coming, or he's not catching them cleanly enough with enough power behind the punch to really get them out of there. And that type of thing doesn't become easier to do as you start fighting truly elite fighters. Usually guys will start their careers racking up a bunch of KOs and TKOs against lesser competition and then start winning more via decision as they start fighting greater fighters. So we'll see how Devin Haney's power carries into his mid-20s. He's still 23 years old. But to win against Devin Haney, JoJo Diaz is going to have to force a fight. He's going to have to be able to put himself into positions where he could just let his hands go. He's going to have to go to the body. He's going to have to fake to the body and go up top. He's going to have to really mix it up with Devin Haney and basically try to lure Devin Haney into the same style of fight that Devin Haney obliged against Jorge Linares in the first half of the fight and through most of the middle and late rounds of the fight as well. Devin Haney kind of showed a different characteristic in his approach in that fight against Linares. But yeah, there's no way that JoJo Diaz is going to win this in a tit-for-tat jab battle. It's just not a winnable style for JoJo Diaz. So the question is, what can he do in terms of head movement, in terms of getting Devin Haney to work at a pace that Devin Haney doesn't usually fight at? He's going to have to up the temperature, up the volume of punches thrown from both guys, round over round over round. That's the style of fight that JoJo Diaz likes to win. Now, when he lost to Gary Russell Jr., it was because of Gary Russell's prodigious hand speed and boxing ability. But Gary Russell's one of those guys whose hand speed is so special, it's just jaw-dropping. You watch the guy, you're like, wow. He just threw 3 punches in a millisecond. And the other guy, just got hit. Wasn't able to return fire or anything. He just got hit. One of those types of just blinding to the eye hand speed. Devin Haney doesn't quite have that. He's got some hand speed, but it's not that type of hand speed. But he is a crisp puncher, and he's about as good defensively as it gets. So I really wonder what JoJo Diaz is going to be able to do to win rounds against Haney. And the fact that JoJo Diaz himself isn't a devastating puncher, this is really an uphill battle, I think. There's going to have to be something that happens, I think, to Devin Haney to kind of tip the scales over to JoJo Diaz's side, like a broken hand or like a clash of heads, something like that. Because if Devin Haney is flowing and is able to kind of maintain range and pace in the way that he normally does, I can see Devin Haney winning by at least a couple rounds, where it's 116 to 112 or worse, 117, 111, 118, 110. I don't see JoJo Diaz being able to outwork Devin Haney and basically win rounds through outworking Devin Haney in the way that he was able to against Fortuna and against Tevin Farmer. I think that Devin Haney is going to want to go for a stoppage because he's becoming one of the more avoided fighters even as a belt holder, which is very unfortunate. I mean, lucky for him, he's still 23 years old, so he, theoretically has much of his career ahead of him. But as it stands, it looks like the other biggest names in the sport or in the division aren't really clamoring to fight the current WBC champ. And there are also cross-promotional issues, political issues, like the reason why you can't just get Devin Haney against PBC's Gervonta Davis or against Bob Arum, top ranks Teofimo Lopez. A lot of those things would have to get worked out, but Devin Haney would do himself a bit of good if he was able to get the stoppage against somebody as rugged and durable and, quite honest, just talented elite or near elite as JoJo Diaz. It would do Devin Haney a world of good to get a stoppage here. I don't think that he'll be able to do it against JoJo Diaz. Not that JoJo Diaz is going to start fighting a purely survivalist fight. I just think that he's durable enough and competitive enough where the rounds will start, noticeably being Devin Haney rounds where, when they throw it to Chris Mannix. How do you have it on the unofficial scorecard? Well, I have it, 8 rounds to 2, through 10, or like 6 rounds to 1 through 7, something like that. Maybe not that lopsided, but I do think that Devin Haney is going to start demonstratively winning the rounds. I don't know if he's going to hurt JoJo Diaz enough to drop him or let alone stop him. But I think that he's going to win by a few rounds. I think that it's going to be one of those things where JoJo Diaz loses via decision, but it looks like he's putting on a spirited effort to where he starts. And this, by the way, was something that my cousin told me when we were talking about this fight. We were just on the phone. My cousin Benji's like, I could see JoJo Diaz basically like appealing to the crowd after the fight saying, hey, this guy was running the whole fight. Did you want to see a fight or did you want to see the stuff that he's doing? And then the crowd kind of like, co-signing JoJo Diaz's perspective as JoJo Diaz tries to paint Devin Haney like an overly defensive fighter. I don't know if that's how the fight's going to play out, but if it does, you could expect that type of thing to happen where, he might not have won the fight, but he won the crowd type of thing for JoJo Diaz. But I don't think he's going to win enough rounds to beat Devin Haney. Devin Haney's just too solid at what he does. Plus, the size advantage, the speed advantage, the fact that JoJo Diaz doesn't even necessarily have a punching power advantage, and just the overall boxing skill, sweet science, quality of Devin Haney is going to allow him to win a, something like a 117 to 111. I'm not even saying like 115 to 113. I don't think it's going to be that close where it's 7 rounds to 5. I think it's going to be more like 8 rounds to 4, something like that. Decision win for Devin Haney, and I just hope that if that is the case, if Devin Haney wins this fight against somebody as good as JoJo Diaz after beating Javier Fortuna, that somebody else, one of these other major names, whether it's Vasily Lomachenko, Ryan Garcia, Gervonta Davis, one of these guys. I just want to see one of these guys get in the ring with Devin Haney so we could start getting the most important fights in one of the most exciting divisions. But yeah, let me know what you think about Haney versus JoJo Diaz. Who do you think will win this fight and how? Let me know in the comments, and please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.